Yes, boss.
Yes, boss.
Yes, boss.
So we've got a guest lecturer today. Nelly, would you like to introduce our guest?
Okay, guys, we have Tariq Toffa.
I'm going to talk about modernism in South Africa. It is the main story of architecture in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, and profoundly shapes the way architects think or influences the way that they think. So it's important as architects to understand that, as planners, but also just to understand your society. Here we are on the southern point of Africa, and South Africa was a settler colony, and the largest settler colony on the African continent, right? So out of all the colonies across the continent, the largest, South Africa is the oldest and a largest settler colony. And so the ideas and trajectories of how Europeans who settled in other parts of the world, it profoundly shaped South African society, and it shapes our cities. So for this reason, you also need to understand modernism on a deeper level, you know, because here in South Africa, where we are, you are all living it, right? You are all living in the cities and the spaces that were shaped by South African modernism, right? We all live it and we experience it every day. And so it is something you should understand. And especially as architects, even more so, if you wish to make change into those environments, you need to know a little bit more about them historically, and also conceptually and intellectually to understand what are the things that shape them and the tools that we're still working with. So we'll first speak a little bit about how modernism is generally discussed, right? So modernism emerges in Europe and North America, and especially on the back of colonialism, because this is in the beginning of the 20th century, and this is still the era of colonialism, Western colonialism, which dominates the planet, basically. There is hardly a piece of the globe that is not dominated in one way by Western colonialism at this time. It is in fact the height of Western colonialism. And modernism is an art and architecture movement that comes out of that period in the beginning of the 20th century. And there is a way in which we traditionally or conventionally talk about it, right? So histories are not a given, right? History is deeply inflected by who is telling the history, who the author is, right? So you could just imagine, let's say in your own home, if someone tells the story of your home, if you told it, it would sound one way. If perhaps your parents told it, it would sound a different way. If the domestic worker told it, it would sound a different way. If the gardener, told it, if the, person who cleans the garbage and picks up the garbage in the streets told it, it would sound a different way, right? So who is telling the story, who is the author of that story, is going to deeply impact the story, right? And this goes for almost anything, right? And it certainly goes for the story of modernism as well. So that story, by and large, has been told by a Euro-American author, right? It has a Euro-American authorship, and it is told through that lens, by and large, right? So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about how the main lines of that story sounds, right? So if we imagine that we are an author sitting in Paris or in London, and or in New York, and we are telling that story, how is that story going to sound if we were sitting in those places, right? So I'll say a little bit about how that story sounds when we sit there. And then I'm going to say, well, hang on, we're not there. We're actually sitting here where we are now in Johannesburg, in Africa, in the southern part of Africa. What does that story sound like when we're sitting here? What does it sound like from our experience here? And it actually sounds a little different, you know. Authorship is very important. And then I'm going to end off with looking at where we are now. Le Corbusier, Charles Edouard Jeanneret, which is his name, he nicknames himself Le Corbusier. And he's an icon of an absolutely central figure in our very idea of what modernism is. So he was an architect and based in Paris. And he has a major work which is written in 1923. And it's originally written as a series of articles, and then it gets compiled into a book. And that book is called Towards a New Architecture. This is his kind of manifesto of what he thinks architecture should be in the 20th century and into the future. So this is his work, written in French and translated later into English. It's very important to see what people actually say than just to hear what others say of them. So I'm going to take you through a few key texts. It's important as students of architecture that you read. I know as architecture students, you believe that design is everything that architecture is. And if you're going to look at books, you're going to be looking at the pictures of the books. And if you read anything in the books, you'll just read the captions. I know it is like that for most students. I was a student once too. But that is really not adequate if you want to understand things more deeply. You know, I hope that at least one or two people in your class is going to become an intellectual, going to become someone who thinks about their society, someone who reads and researches, who becomes an academic, who becomes a critical intellectual. I hope at least there is a few of you, because South Africa and the African continent generally critically needs people in the built environment who are engaged with that kind of thought. So design is one part of architecture, but it is not all of it. And only looking at pictures and only considering design, it's a particular part of architecture, but it's not going to help you to understand the society that you live in. So you need to read. And so I'm going to today make you read a few things. You must be familiar with texts. And so we're gonna have a very quick overview, very briefly, of just pulling out a few things. So this is Le Corbusier's big text that he writes, Towards a New Architecture, from 1923. Let's see what he says. This is in a way, the voice of modernism at the time, right? This is its vision, its pride, its arrogance, its conceit, all of that stuff, you will see it in there. So this is the introduction by a figure called Frederick Etchells. Let's just read quickly what Frederick Etchells says. An architecture of our age is slowly but surely shaping itself. Its main lines become more and more evident. The use of steel and reinforced concrete construction, of large areas of plate glass, of standardized units, as for example in metal windows, of flat roofs, of new synthetic materials and new surface treatments of metals that machinery has made possible, of hints taken from airplanes. So they're talking about all kinds of new technologies that are now available for architects to use, you know. Reinforced concrete, we can now make buildings, bigger, taller buildings, you know. Large areas of plate glass, you know, we don't need bricks holding up a building. We now have reinforced concrete and we can have huge areas of glass, you know. We can standardize things. Everything doesn't have to be made by a craftsman and take forever. We can industrialize things, you know. We have new kinds of materials, metals, you know, and then he continues. And hints taken from the airplane, the motor car, the steamship, where it was never possible from the beginning to attack the problem from the academic standpoint. So we can start to be inspired by things that are not considered architecture, but now we can consider them as inspirations for architecture. Look at aeroplanes, look at motor cars, look at steamships. This will be the inspiration for architecture, you know. All these things are helping at any rate to produce a 20th century architecture whose lineaments are already clearly traceable, a certain squareness of mass and outline, right? So things now have to look orthogonal, clean lines, straight lines, a crisscross of gridiron treatment with an emphasis on the horizontal and extreme bareness of wall surface, a pervading austerity and economy, and a minimum of ornament. These are all among its characteristics. What he means is going to become more and more evident, right? He's describing a new architecture that is emergent, an architecture that doesn't look like traditional kinds of architecture as we would usually imagine them. These buildings look like boxes. They have straight orthogonal lines. They are much more austere. Ornamentation has been stripped away. And this, architects are thinking, is what a new architecture of the new age must look like, right? Let's see what Corbusier says. So Corbusier opens, these are his chapters here. He opens with a chapter called The Engineer's Aesthetic and Architecture. We're only going to read a little piece from that bit. It's his opening. The Engineer's Aesthetic and Architecture. So what Corbusier is about to tell us is how architecture needs to be inspired by this kind of design, right? He's going to tell us how engineering has a particular aesthetic, and that has to become architecture. That has to become what architects think about. So here is Le Corbusier's opening paragraph. He says, the engineer's aesthetic and architecture, two things that march together. Now, Corbusier writes in a very lyrical way, and he's kind of his own mythologist. He almost mythologizes. He hypes up. It's almost as if he considers himself a kind of a poet of the age. So he doesn't write in a direct way. He writes in a very poetic kind of a way. So here he writes, the English aesthetic and architecture, two things that march together and follow one from another. The one at its full height, meaning engineering, the other in an unhappy state of retrogression, meaning architecture, right? He's saying engineering is soaring. Engineering is in a new golden age, But architecture is in a rut. It's stuck in the past. It needs to wake up, right? This is kind of what he's saying. The engineer, inspired by the law of economy and governed by mathematical calculation, puts us in accord with universal law. He achieves harmony, right? This is Corbusier's poetics, right? So he's saying the engineer is in touch with the universal laws of mathematics and science, right? An order which we feel to be in accordance with that of our world. So the modern world, he's saying, is about objectivity, universality, science, maths, and engineers encapture that more than anyone else. And this is the future. And you will still hear people today talking like this, right? This is almost exactly a century ago that he says this, and you will still hear people today who speak like this, who still speak with this kind of vision and spirit and view of the world, right? That science is our future, universal law, mathematical calculation, technological innovation, right? So this is what Corbusier is saying. Let's read on. He says, man's stock of tools marks out the stages of civilization. The tool is the direct and immediate expression of progress. A bad tool, it must be thrown away and replaced, right? So he's saying that technology marks the stages of civilization, right? It's a very particular view of civilization. Now, that need not be your view of civilization. Civilizations could be defined by many things, right? By how pluralistic they are, how ethical they are, how tolerant they are of others, how happy people are, you know, a family life, social values, how well people live with the landscape, with the you know, bioclimatic factors, living with animals, living with the earth, all kinds of ways in which we can define or think about the successes of a civilization. This is a very particular modernistic approach, right? That it is industrial technology that defines whether a civilization is advanced or not. And then he invokes this idea of progress, right? Progress. Civilizations must progress. Toward what end? You know. But these are the things he's invoking. Who is progressing? On what basis? Who is a progressed civilization? Who is not a progressed civilization? Right? And according to him, it is technology, the tool, industrialized technology, modern technology. Right? This is what he's saying defines a civilization and whether it is good or not. Let's go on. He says, our engineers produce architecture, right? He's saying architects don't produce architecture anymore. Engineers produce architecture. For they employ a mathematical calculation which derives from natural law, and their works give us the feeling of harmony. The engineer, therefore, has his own aesthetic, right? Engineers are producing architecture because they are in touch with science and maths and natural law and universal values and so on, right? Engineers are making architecture. Architects are no longer making architecture. This is what Corbusier is saying. Our external world has been enormously transformed in its outward appearance and in the use made of it by reason of the machine. We have gained a new perspective and a new social life, but we have not yet adapted the house thereto. Yes. So he's saying we are now living like everything is mechanized. Things work like machines, but architecture hasn't woken up to this reality yet. And then he gives his advice to architects. He says, all your energies are directed towards, in other words, must be directed towards this magnificent end, which is the foregoing of the tools of the epoch, and which is creating throughout the whole world this accumulation of very beautiful things in which economic law reigns supreme and mathematical exactness is joined by daring and imagination. Okay, very lyrical stuff. Let us purge our houses, reconstruct our towns. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I was going to make a comment about where you said engineers produce architecture.
Yes. Yes.
Because sorry, I've just been thinking about it, and I was just realized that I do agree in it, but then I also see it as a sense of, I feel like we all have like an engineering aspect in every architect, because I think that when you think of your design, you want to think of how it's going to be constructed, but you're not necessarily have a full idea or full understanding of how it's going to be, but you kind of have like an imagination of ways of how it could be constructed. So it's more I'm saying that I'm agreeing on the fact that engineers do produce architecture, but also engineers do produce architects, but also every architect has a engineering instinct in them.
Okay, so you are wooed, in other words. You know what wooing is?
Oh no, please explain to me.
Woo is, you know, when let's say someone is interested in a beautiful young woman, he woos her, he courts her, you know. He tells her all kinds of nice and lovely and beautiful and romantic things. So Corbusier is almost like he's wooing us. He's telling us, this is our future. This is where you need to go. This is what our time is. This is what is progressive. This is where you need to move. This is what you need to be. And he is, I'm saying he's wooing you. You are taken up, right? You're saying, yes, it is so.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. No, I'm not going to, thanks for jumping in and interrupting me. I really appreciate it. Let's hold on to that thought. We'll return to it, hey? And let me hear more from you as we go forward. So I'm not going to read any more from Le Corbusier because all his stuff is like this. It's so lyrical and poetic, and you could actually say it in a very few, in much fewer lines than he does. So we're going to take a lot of time if you read too much of it. But I just want you to get a sense of what he says. So let's just whiz very quickly through his book. So without reading much more of it. So he tells us, he opens us by telling us that the engineer has an aesthetic. It is in tune with its age, the modern age, science, technology, progress, right? And architects need to catch a wake up, right? This is what he tells us. And then he goes on to tell us, to show us things that architecture should be inspired by, right? And his book is full of images which he thinks should be the inspiration for a modern architecture, right? So he shows us silos, you know, these kind of industrial things that would not normally be considered even architecture, these functional industrial landscapes. He says this must be the inspiration for architecture, this kind of aesthetic, right? This kind of austerity, monumentality, or whatever else this represents. This must be our inspiration, right? So he shows us all of these silos, and then he goes on to look at shipping liners, you know, which has, you know, perhaps one has never considered that this kind of new structure, this kind of technology can be considered an inspiration for architecture. Corbusier says this must be what architecture starts to look like, right? And then look at the scale of it. You know, architecture can now be of an unimaginable scale, right? Look how many city blocks it can encompass. Look how many monuments a single object can encompass. Architecture can now speak to a scale never before imagined, right? This is the inspiration for new architecture. Silos, shipping containers, these long horizontal lines, these repetitive horizontals and verticals. This is where we must look, right? Aeroplanes, another inspiration for architecture. Architects need to be inspired by these kind of shapes, these kind of aesthetics. This is what architecture must start to draw from. Automobiles, right? Silos, shipping liners. Now it goes on to automobiles. This is the inspiration for new architecture. It must draw from this stuff. And then he ends off with buildings themselves. We'll just read one line of this and then we'll end off. So he ends off here with what the buildings of an architecture is going to start to look like when it is inspired by this new modern age. He says, I think this is his final chapter, which is called Mass Production Houses. He says, if we eliminate from our hearts and minds all dead concepts, in other words, everything before this is a dead concept, because we are, as he sees it, and his contemporaries see it, we are in a new age. We are in a new time. We are in a time that needs new concepts, and all previous concepts are dead. They no longer are suitable for our time. So he says, if we eliminate from our hearts and minds all dead concepts in regard to the houses and look and the question from a critical and objective point of view, we shall arrive at the house machine, the mass production house. So he's saying architecture must become like a machine. Then it is suited to its time. Then it speaks to its time. Then it is in sync with its time. We want a house machine. We want an architecture that is like a machine, a mass-produced house. In the same way we have mass-produced cars, mass-produced airplanes, mass-produced products, mass-produced consumption items. In the same way, you need mass-produced houses. Okay. This is how architecture will speak to its time. And then he shows us some images. Houses that are orthogonal, block-like, flat roofs, straight lines, cube-like. So this is what he imagines it to look like: cubes, orthogonal lines, straight lines, blank facades, flat roofs, right? This is how the house machine, repetitive, almost industrialized repetition, right? You can see it here, you can see it in the plan, in the elevations, etc. This is the house machine, right? And these are his images. Okay, that's Corbusier's book, Towards a New Architecture.
When you were speaking of the house machine, before I asked my other question, then I saw the following slides, and I realized that actually meant of an actual house machine, where it's all inspired by all like industrial buildings and ships and all that. But then before that, I thought his concept of house machine was thinking of housing as a gadget, like the cell phone gadget that constantly needs an improvement. That constantly need an improvement of creating new gadgets, like a competitive kind of thing. But now, how do we do that if housing are supposed to be a permanent thing, to last longer, Because I mean, if we look at housing that we build only maybe for 5 years and then destroy it and rebuild it just to keep up with the time spent, then are we not kind of like wasting a lot of resources and all of that?
There was a period of time, if we look at the United States, where many housing projects, many modernist housing projects were destroyed, meaning they were blown up, they were demolished, because they were considered to create such and inhumane environments, actually, that the governments at the time just felt the best thing to do is just raze them to the ground. So there were many, they're known as the projects in the United States. Many of them were actually literally demolished. So it is a question, if this is a way of housing for the future. It didn't take long before people really started to question if it was even suitable for the time, let alone the future time. Even in the 20th century itself, it very quickly was open to a lot of questions. There is a question from Nelly.
I'm just going to comment about like what you're saying. So also with Villa Savoy, which is one of his most popular buildings that he's done. I mean, it was a huge fail. And, you know, at the time, he was literally initiating all his ideas about functionality through Villa Savoy. And, you know, when you're reading through the plan, like literally, you know, it's very functional. You come in through the basement parking, you go into the kitchen, and then you go up to the living space, and then you go up to the roof garden. It's really practical, literally. But, you know, people are not that practical. People, you know, just do things so differently, and it failed as a building. It just it didn't work out, and people even made comments about how horrible it was, even like mentally, to live in that space.
The building is what is known as colonialism, modernism, which means it's on columns raised above the ground. Right? So the building is separated from its landscape. It's raised above it, and then it's designed for a car. You arrive on the site in a car, and the car turns around the building and parks, right? It's not for a human being, it's for a car, right? Its primary approach is for a car. Then you get out of your garage and you enter the building and you wind up a ramp until you get to the roof. So it's a traditional kind of of architecture, if we can speak in such general terms. Generally has always found a way to speak more closely to its landscape, generally speaking. This is the opposite of that. It is lifting it above the landscape. It is not the human scale approaching, it is the movement pattern of a car, right? So these are all the dynamics of this machine house, this modern technology, industrialization, mass producing, etc., the modern age. And it's still we still produce car-dominated environments, car-dominated urban landscapes, etc., right? So we have really, I mean, it's a much more vast and complex subject, but we have internalized many of these values. How did these ideas enter into South African architecture? So I want to look at another text, because I said I want you guys to become familiar with texts, right? So we looked at Le Corbusier's big text towards a new architecture. This is our second text I want you to know. It is authored by Clive Chipkin, who was an architect that lived through much of the 20th century, through apartheid, through the post-apartheid years, and he died very recently. He was an architect and an architectural historian, and he wrote this book called Johannesburg Style, Joburg from its origins up to the 1960s, right? And it has become a key text on architecture. Almost it's become a canon. You know, a canon is like an authoritative text, a text that everyone references. It's become that kind of a text, right? It is sort of your go-to book for the history of architecture in Johannesburg. And Chipkin writes this book in 1993. It is published. Okay, so it's been around for a while already. We're not going to read all of it, but we're going to jump to chapter 5 of it, which he calls Johannesburg, Paris. Okay, and Corbusier, who's based in Paris, South African architects at the time, in the early 1900s, are going to develop a very strong link with Paris. And Corbusier to white South African architects, because of course the whole profession is entirely white and male. These architects are going to, Corbusier is almost going to become like a cult figure, you know, intellectually, aspirationally. Many architects in South Africa are going to be looking towards Paris and looking towards the figure of Corbusier. He becomes almost like a cult figure. And so Chipkin names this chapter Johannesburg, Paris, almost as if there's a link. There's a direct flight, a direct road between Johannesburg and Paris. And this is the kind of architecture that starts to be produced in Johannesburg, in South Africa, in the 1930s and onwards. The same kind of ideas, the same kind of aesthetics. We're not going to read much about this. I just want you to see the correspondence. In other words, how these ideas, the same ideas, are circulating in South Africa. Okay, let's just read a few sentences from Chipkin. That modernism was a change of style that transformed the face of South African architecture. Undoubtedly, the establishment of the Department of Architecture at the University of the Witwatersrand was a major factor in the change of face that South African architecture underwent. For it was from this source at Wits that a stream of imported ideas of modernity would disseminate, and from which, after 1929, a new generation of architects committed to these ideas would emerge, right? So from the end of the 1920s, Wits is going to produce architects that are schooled in these modernist, Corbusian ideas about things, right? And it is from that base, these graduates and the Wits School and Pretoria soon after it as well, University of Pretoria, that these ideas disseminate into the architectural profession and thinking and shape the South African landscape. A new thinking, a new age, a new time. And then he has the next chapter called Houghton Villas. Let's just read a few sentences from it. Chipkin writes, the Johannesburg-Paris axis of mind was now established, and with it, a growing personality cult around the figure of Le Corbusier, right? As I said, almost a direct conceptual and intellectual line between Johannesburg and Paris, and especially with the figure of Le Corbusier. Chipkin continues, Le Corbusier's ideas began to take shape on the Highveld, right? In the Johannesburg and surrounding areas. Le Corbusier had his white cubic villas raised up on pilotis, right? The columns, the build like Villa Savoy, raised up on pilotis with curvilinear space forms, horizontal windows, flat roof terraces. Martinsen, this is Martinsen, this is him in Paris because he visited Corbusier several times. So this is him dressed like almost like a Parisian intellectual with a pipe and so on, and there's a French poster in the background. He becomes a key figure, a seminal figure on the local scene, right? He becomes this authority of modernism. And he also takes over the architecture, South African Architectural Journal, okay? So he's a key voice at this time. Martinsen and his group would have equivalent examples in Johannesburg's growing northern suburbs, particularly in Lower Houghton and adjacent areas, right? So the same kind of modernist structures that have been built in Paris and its outskirts are now being built in the suburbs of Johannesburg, especially in Houghton. Houghton is a very wealthy suburb in Johannesburg. The new rich suburb of Lower Houghton became a characteristic area for contemporary architecture, right? So in these Houghton mansions, it is where we see the first emerging modernist architecture in South Africa. Let's read just a little bit more. Chipkin says, for the new Houghton house owners, modernists meant identifying with Beverly Hills and swimming pool poshness, right? In other words, there was an elitism about this modernism, right? After all, Le Corbusier's villa was built for a captain of industry, and at least 3 of his villas were commissioned by aspiring Americans from the newly mobile classes, right? So he's saying it is modernism, when it emerges in South Africa, is an elite. It is in an elite sphere, an elite segment of society, as it was. Chipkin makes the comparison. I think that is all we're going to read. So these are kind of just to whiz through and see some of the buildings that emerged in Houghton and the wealthy, affluent suburbs of Johannesburg. And you can see what they look like, right? They're these cube-like orthogonal shapes, large panes of glass, flat roofs, exposed concrete beams, repetition, etc. You know, ramps were very important. And this is the modernist aesthetic, right? And then we'll leave it there. So the point that we're making is, you know, we looked at Corbusier's ideas in his own words, and then looking at how those very ideas emerge in South Africa and in Johannesburg especially, and how it is orientated, how the modernism has a close link towards Paris and the figure of Le Corbusier especially. I'm going to move on to changing the position of where we are. So thus far, we've been sitting in Europe, and we've been sitting in the architecture school of South African universities, and we've been sitting in the wealthy white suburbs of Johannesburg, right? We have been looking at the world from those places. We have imagined that we are a homeowner in Houghton. We have imagined that we are a professor in the Wits School of Architecture in the 1930s. And we have imagined that we are a flamboyant, charismatic, poetic, modern architect in Paris, right? We have imagined that we are those things. But for most of us, we are not those things, right? We are sitting here, we are in Africa, and most of us are Africans in one way or another. We're from this place in one way or another. And we generally experience this thing called modernism, not in the ways that it has been described, but in very different kinds of ways. So let us change where we are sitting. In other words, let us change our authorship. Let us change who is speaking and who is writing and who is thinking and who is seeing and who is speaking. Let us change our vantage point for a little bit. And we will arrive, when we do that, we start to ask different questions. And we start to come at different answers. And we start to see things from different angles. You know, it is not that what has been said thus far is untrue, but it is to understand that it is being said from a very particular kind of perspective. A very particular kind of person is speaking, of authorship, a very particular kind of authorship. And if we change position, you'll see the authorship changes, the questions change, the experiences change, right? If you remember my little analogy I gave you earlier, if you are, say, the homeowner that commissioned a modernist mansion in Houghton, because they were mansions, on a large plot with a swimming pool and a roof terrace and all of that, right? And you tell that story, and you are thinking that you are, you know, an extension of Beverly Hills or whatever, you know, then say you're the domestic worker, you know. So about a fifth of South African women are domestic workers. It's a huge number, working in the wealthy and middle class suburbs. You now imagine you tell the story of this home. What story would you tell? Is it going to sound like anything we just said? It will sound nothing like what we just said, right? Why? Because we've changed perspective. We've changed authorship. We've changed how we experience the place. And from that different vantage point and experience, we ask different questions because we have a different experience of that place. So let's do that for a moment. This is a project I did a while ago. This is an art installation at Villa Savoye in Poissy in France, on the outskirts of Paris. And this is a provocative art installation. What do you guys think when you see this? What kind of an art installation is that, juxtaposed with that? Why put these two things together? What does this say about this? And what does this say about this?
If
And
I
what do they
may,
mean when you put them together?
so if I have to guess, I would say the
Okay,
one
go
on the
ahead.
left is brutalism. So if you just look at the contradictions between the technologies of the two, so the one on the right looks like an older technology, so the hay and the wood. So it creates almost like a difference in era, whereas the one on the left looks like a brutalist structure. So it almost creates like this contradiction between technologies and movements.
A contrast between technologies. Okay. Anyone else?
I mean, the simplicity of what I'm getting from it is we see the concept, the idea, the concept on the right, and then we see how someone interpreted that in their own way on the left.
Okay. So this is a concept and this is an interpretation. Okay.
Yes.
I want you guys to, for a moment, stop thinking like you're an architect. Stop answering me in an it sounds strange, but go with me. Stop thinking like an architect in terms of styles, in terms of technologies. Think like a human being for a moment. You are a human being before you're an architect. As a human being and as an African and as a person of Southern Africa, where you are, you look at this, what does it say about you, who you are?
When I see the Le Corbusier building, the thing that I think is simple, and yes, and the other structure, the first thing that I'm thinking about is authenticity and real, and yes, real and authenticity. The other one for me is simple and rational.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in terms of the cube-like shapes and so on. It's a simple volumes. This idea about this being more authentic, I would interpret you mean that is closer to, you have a closer sense of connection to that in terms of your own history and place in the world, right? It is closer to your own, you know, when you say something is authentic, it means you resonate with it. You know, it's closer to your sense of identity or your sense of self or your sense of your history, right?
Yes, definitely.
Does anyone else want to comment?
Sorry, I just want to comment, and I feel it shows like contrast between the two buildings, almost like how you have this class gap within our country here, where it's this disconnect almost, while still drawing inspiration from the other.
Yes, there does seem to be a huge disconnect, like it's almost a deliberate contrast, isn't it? It seems like there's a world, like a chasm between the one and the other, doesn't it? Like they are two different sides of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yes, it is.
Imagine this is saying something about it's saying something about people. It's saying something about humanity. Maybe the question is too deep or too personal. So these are images I pulled out of property websites. And I was amazed about how many images I could find of lapas next to modern suburban houses. Look how many I found. Here's a lapa and a lawn next to a suburban house. It seems so benign. It seems like something we've all seen, isn't it? What does it mean to have a thatch, organic shaped thatch building next to your suburban house? Modern suburbia, little thatch dwelling. What does that mean? Where does that come from? What ideas are circulating here? What is modern? What is traditional? What is rustic? What is the new age? What is primitive? What is civilized? This is the echoes of that very art installation we just looked at.
Okay, I would have said that it's more of like taking like a piece of home with you in terms of architecture, like having like a lapa next to like a modern house, you know.
What do you think about Le Corbusier's statement? You are the side of, in case you were confused, you are not the modern side of the world. You are the primitive side of the world. What do you think about that?
Should I think about the Le Corbusier building?
No, I'm talking about you. Forget Corbusier's building for a moment. So stop being an architect for a moment. I'm talking about you. You in this scheme, in this view of the world, you are not modern civilization. You are the primitive. Modern civilization are people on the other side of the world. This is what Corbusier is saying. What do you think about that? Let's go back to Corbusier. This is just, I mean, there are lots of text. I just pulled out one little quote here. Let's read some more of what he said. Okay. Remember, what are we doing now? We are changing perspective. And from what I gather, you are finding it very hard to change perspective. It seems that it is very easy for you to position yourself in Paris, to position yourself as a white architectural professor in the architecture school of Wits. It seems very easy for you to do that. But when I ask you to think about you being you, who you actually are, because you are not a Parisian architect and you are not a professor at Wits in the 1930s, you find it difficult to find your own voice. You find it difficult to author your own words and your own thoughts, and it's not your fault. Because this is the canon, if you remember how I described a canon. A canon is the authorized version. It is the official rubber-stamped version. And this is the official version of architecture, right? As Chipkin points out, this is the official version of the story of modernism as it emerges in the 20s and 30s in Johannesburg, right? You are very comfortable with that story. But then I switch perspective for you and I say, but you are not those people. According to that view, you are not the new age. You are not the future. You are not modern times. In fact, according to that view, you are the opposite of those things here in Africa. We are the opposite. In that view of the world, we are its opposite. We are its antithesis. We are the primitives. So the thing that you are associating yourself with is not you. It is the thing that is the opposite of those things, the primitive that this view of the world considers you to belong to. Do you understand what I'm saying? So let's read a little bit more of Corbusier. This is Corbusier's called Journey to the East. In 1911, he traveled from Paris, or I think it was from Paris that he left his destination, and he traveled eastward through Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and his journey ended in Istanbul, right? Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Caliphate, right? The capital of Islamic civilization. So he leaves the familiarity of Paris and he travels through the sort of peasant countrysides of Eastern Europe and arrives in Turkey, in Istanbul, right? And he writes about that journey. And at the time, this is in 1911, he's a young 24-year-old architect. And he writes about his experiences. And his experiences would live with him through his life. And this is a sketch of him, right? We're just going to grab a little bit from what he says. This is his journey, where he travels from Paris through Eastern Europe, ends up in Istanbul, and goes back through Greece and Italy and back to Spain, right? His 1911 journey. He includes his trips to Italy in 1907 and Germany 1910, so it is over a few years. But this is his travels, okay? Let's read a little bit from the opening of what Corbusier writes about, his experience and his encounter with non-Parisians in the rural countrysides of Eastern Europe and Turkey. He says, Corbusier says, the 24-year-old in 1911, he says, the art of the peasant is a striking creation of aesthetic sensuality. If art elevates itself above the sciences, it is precisely because, in opposition to them, it stimulates sensuality and awakens profound echoes in the physical being. So he's saying, on one side you have science, dry, clean, objective, pure, and on the other side you have sensuality, the body, the physical, right? The opposite of science, right? All things sensual, all things bodily. It gives to the body. So he's talking about the art of peasant life, right? These simple people from the countryside, right? Their life, their culture, their architecture gives to the body, to the animal, its fair share. And then upon this healthy base, conducive to the expansion of joy, it knows how to erect the most noble of pillars, right? So he's saying that if the body is like your animal, you have this intellectual, scientific part of you, and then you have this bodily, animalistic, sensual part of you. And he's saying in this simple countryside life, it is more in tune with the animal, more in tune with the body, more in tune with the part of the human that is more like an animal than a scientist, right? He carries on. Thus, this traditional art, like a lingering warm caress, embraces the entire land. It has spread out without constraint, with the spiritedness of a beautiful animal, the magic of geometry an astonishing union of fundamental instincts and of those susceptible to more abstract speculations. The color, it too is not descriptive, but evocative, always symbolic. It jostles the great, again, you know, very poetic, even in his 20s. It jostles the great inhibited giants, even the Giottos, even the Grecos, the Cezannes and the Van Goghs, right? He's saying this simple culture, this simple architecture, this simple art has a quality of its own. Considered from a certain point of view, folk art outlives the highest of civilizations. It remains a norm, a sort of measure, a norm, a sort of measure whose standard is man's ancestor, the savage, if you will. Okay, now there's a lot of lyrical, almost ramble at times. But what is he saying here? He's saying that there is, outside of the urban, sophisticated civilization and urban class and intellectual classes that he frequents, when you go into the simple lands of simple peoples, like the countrysides of Turkey and Eastern Europe, their people are more in touch with their animal nature. They are like a savage, man's ancestor, something man used to be once upon a time, right? Something that was more simple, something that was closer to their own animal nature, right? So there's an idea of evolution very much embedded in here, that these simple creatures, these simple peoples, are almost like an earlier form of human being. They have not yet evolved in this urban modern civilization. They are like man's ancestor, you know, like a touchstone, something he used to be, a savage, an animal, you know, in touch with their physical being, more connected to the body, to the animal, you know. This is what he's saying. This is the world of the primitive that he's describing. And the world that he's coming from is what he defines as modern times, right? So in your architecture schools, you are being taught as if you are this world. You are this world. In other words, you are being positioned there. You are taught to see the world from that position where that story was being told. But actually, in that story, who are you in that story? In that story, you are the animal. You are the savage. You are the primitive. You are the opposite and the antithesis of that modern age in Africa and in, you know, South Asia and in Indonesia and India and China and, you know, Central America and all the places where Western civilization had not yet established root. They are the primitives. They are the opposite of modern times. The savage, right? So you see what happens when we change perspective. We start to have a different experience of the place. We start to ask different kinds of questions from our different experience of that reality. We did not live in Villa Savoie. We did not live in the, you know, the mansions of Houghton. You know, why do we describe architecture as if we are the owner of that home and we ourselves lived in that home and we ourselves designed that home when you are not that person? It's like a cognitive dissonance, you know. You know, stories have different characters and we're imagining that we are one character, but in the story we're actually the other character. We're imagining that we are the heroes and the heroines, but actually you're not the hero of the story. Maybe that's a bit of a kind of a lightning bolt to you. Let's move on and look at an architectural historian. This is a famous history of architecture called A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method. It was originally written in the 1890s, and it's now in its, still being published today in its like 20th revision or something, right? It's a very important and authoritative text on architecture, on the history of architecture. And it is written by an architect called Sir Bannister Fletcher, who is based in London, right? Professor Bannister Fletcher, and he's writing from London, a history of architecture. Yeah, he's based in London. And he's writing in the 1890s and early 1900s, okay? And he has a whole volume of architecture, a huge collection, a thick book, and almost the entire book is devoted to Europe and North America. Almost the entirety of the book, over 90% of the book is about Europe and North America, even though it's a history of world architecture. Almost all of it is only about Europe and North America. A small portion of the end of the book is about the rest of the world, that is not Europe and North America. Just a small portion, which he calls non-historical styles, meaning they have no importance, they have no real value in the history of anything. They don't lead to anywhere. They are dead concepts, as Corbusier calls them. They are dead ends. They are not, they do not evolve. They do not, they have nothing to do with modern civilization. They're all outdated, backwards, primitive, animal, savage, etc. So let's just read what Sir Bannister Fletcher in 1905 says. So he's almost a contemporary of Corbusier. Let's read what Bannister Fletcher, as an architectural historian, says about what Corbusier calls the primitives in other non-European world. Sir Bannister Fletcher, a professor in London, in his History of Architecture, writes, the non-historical styles, in other words, the non-West, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Central American, etc., are those which developed mainly on their own account and exercise little direct influence on other styles. In other words, they don't influence anything in the world. They have not shaped modern civilization in any way, or in any way that is important. They can thus be studied independently and need not interrupt the story of the evolution of European historical architecture dealt with in part one, right? As I said, the majority of the book is dealing with Europe and North America, right? And that, the architecture of Europe and North America, shapes the architecture of modern civilization. The rest of the world doesn't. It's quite inconsequential, right? And for that reason, he says you can just as well study it independently. It is of no real import, no real value in the story of architecture. It may just be a matter of interest, like a fetish or something. Then you can study it, but not because it has any real value. So he says that's why he puts it at the end of the book rather than in chronological order. Because if you put it in chronological order, it would mess up the rhythm. You'd start to think that these things have a place in the story of architecture, and they don't. So he puts it right at the end of the book, so you don't get confused that they have any value. The position which they should occupy in the history of architecture is, however, a matter of doubt. In other words, it's questionable whether history should even mention these people in this architecture of the non-West. What Corbusier calls the primitive. It's questionable whether it even deserves a mention. Saracenic architecture, in other words, the architecture of Islamic civilizations, is not generally considered important, although it certainly influences it to some extent. Okay. From an architect's point of view, these non-historical styles of the non-West can scarcely be so interesting as those which have progressed on the solution of constructive problems, in other words, technology, industrialization. If you remember all Corbusier's, the inspiration for modern architecture, the silos, the automobiles, the steamliners, the airplanes, right? All of these wonders of modern technology, right? This is what determines progress, right? And from an architect's point of view, says Professor Bannister Fletcher, these architectures of the non-West can scarcely be so interesting as those which have progressed, right? This idea of progression, of progress, on the solution of constructive problems, right? It is their technologies that define them as a civilization and define their superiority as a civilization. Resolutely met and overcome, as was the case in Europe, right? So he's saying, he's echoing Corbusier in other words, right? He's saying, on one side are the primitives and the other modern times, right? He's echoing Corbusier's words where Corbusier speaks of man's stock of tools marks out the stages of civilization, as Corbusier said in 1923, right? It's this idea that Europe and North America's technological advancement and this and related qualities of its civilization distinguish it above all other civilizations, right? Distinguishes modern civilization from a primitive civilization, distinguishes modern man from ancient man, distinguishes a civilized human being from a savage, distinguishes a human from an animal, right? These are all the words and the language that they are using to characterize this two different kinds of worlds. They are setting these up as two different kinds of worlds, two different kinds of humanities, two different kinds of a modern civilization and a primitive one. Okay, and the architecture embodies all of those ideas, right? This is a colonial era where European empires are dominant across the whole world, and the architecture style of modernism is coming out of that era, and it is embedded in those ideas, and it has those ideas embedded in it. And we can hear it in Corbusier's own words. We can hear it in Bannister Fletcher's own words, right? So let me remind you where we came from. As we started off telling the canonical story. In other words, we are not telling the whole story of modernism, by the way. We don't have time to do that. I'm just giving you little glimpses, little pieces of things to give a general impression of certain aspects of modernism. There are also other things to speak about, and other researchers speak about other dimensions, but I'm just highlighting a few points that we have time to cover. We looked at if we are sitting in Paris, and if we are the professor of, you know, architecture at Wits in the 1930s and 1920s, what kind of stories, what kind of view of the world was being articulated? It was a view that saw the West at the height of its powers, controlling and dominating over much of the globe. It had ascendancy, power, ascendancy of military might, ascendancy of economic strength. Apparently its superiority in the world meant that its culture was superior to all else. Its humans, its people, their appearances were superior. Everything about this culture and this civilization was superior to all else, right? And its architecture too, its architectural styles too are superior. And the peoples, if we change perspective and we say, but we are not, you know, sitting from the vantage point of London at the height of its power, British Empire. We are actually the people in the colonies. We are actually the opposite end. We are the poorer figure in this story. We are not the heroes. How does this affect us? You know, what does this say about us? Are we really animals? Are we really savages? Are we really primitives as we are being described as? Is that what we are in this story? What is the value of architectures that we have produced, and settlements and cultures and spaces and architectures that we have produced? Does it have any value in this scheme? Do we have any value? What place do we have in this story? Right? These are the kinds of questions you ask when you change your perspective. Right? And you are students, so it is very difficult for you because you are learning a story at the same time that you have to be questioning the story that you're learning. That's a very difficult thing to do, right? So I'm giving you both things at once. I'm giving you an official story and I'm questioning the story for you. You get both the story and the question to the story. Right, so it's an unsettled thing that I'm giving you, because you are not the hero of that story, and you need to acknowledge that you are not the hero in that story. Remember, when in the architecture schools of these times, there were no Black Africans in those schools, right? It was and largely remains an almost entirely white profession in South Africa, and in many parts of the world in the West. Do you have any questions about that? That's the ground we covered. I placed you in one place, and then I switched perspective and I put you in another place. And I showed you the completely different kinds of questions you have and view of the world that you have when you switch places. And you guys were thinking that you were sitting here. And I'm telling you, you are not sitting there. You are sitting over here. But you are seeing yourself through that lens, right? So here's an author writing about the African colonies and the colonies of the non-Western peoples of the world, writing about them. And you are sitting here, but you are looking at yourself through that lens. And you need to start standing here and looking from where you are, and producing history from where you are, and producing theory from where you are, and producing thought from where you are, right? That's why I said in the beginning, I hope that some of you become writers, authors, novelists, theorists, poets, whatever it might be, so that you can start to write from this position, write theory from here, right? Write critical thinking from here. And we need that. And architecture schools don't produce people like that. It produces people who like to look at pictures, who breeze through books and only look at the pictures and read the captions. Because we are designers. Yes, we are designers. But we must be more than that. We must be people who think, people who understand their history, their world, where they come from, where they are going, and then what role you can play to bring some benefit to people, right?
From what I've heard today, there's a bit of realization of, I don't know how to put it, but for me personally, I feel like modernism was quite, or rather, Le Corbusier's principles of modernism were quite anti-African, in a sense where, for example, one of the functions talk about the rejection of ornamentation, and I think he knew how what ornamentation meant to African countries or African cultures, and it made me think of modernism in a very different way. And it also made me think of how where we stand as African spatial planners or African architects in this realm of architecture in the world. And it also made me question of all the, for example, urban spaces that we have created, because we always use Western ideologies of space planning and building, create space African people. And I think most of them are always failing, and I think we never talk about the reason why this.
Is there anyone else? Last one before we move on. Anyone else wants to add a comment?
So my comment is, I think the points that you've raised today are things that quite a few of us, well, more specifically me, have started to question in terms of the interpretation of modernism. And I think that with the readings we've done in terms of how modernism was interpreted for the benefit of the apartheid regime in South Africa, I think we start to see quite a lot of similarities between the non-European housing project which was implemented and the RDP projects which are currently being built. And there's quite a lot of similarities that we see there. But also I think it's only with exposure to African vernacular architecture that we can start to see how our buildings can change, because as much as a student you want to incorporate or include or like design spaces for Africans or from an African perspective, it's hard to do that without the knowledge, firstly. And secondly, because we've been taught Western ideas for so long, and what is acceptable or aesthetically pleasing, it then becomes hard to fully translate African architecture or your intentions with African principles.
Okay. Is there another hand up? Is it Tipiso again?
Yes, I wanted to add, and adding to what Antando said about us thinking about what's aesthetically pleasing as African designers. There is always this idea that we have of what's aesthetically pleasing because of what we have been taught and what we have, yes, what we have been taught, yes, what we have been taught about aesthetic and what represents Western ideas, and also, yes, and also, yeah, it's just, as a students, it's very difficult for us to quite find our place as African designers because of the theory that, or what we have been taught, what's design, or yes, or what's construction, because we are always we believe that there's an element of superiority in Western ideas, and whenever you come with an African concept, it's, you know, it's sometimes thought to not fully developed, or rather not there yet. You see, yes, thank you.
I think to add more what my mates were just saying, I think that we really just need to relook at our educational system, especially if we want to create, if we want to start creating stories for ourselves from now on. It's more of what do we teach the people that go to school. Like, you know, like in architecture, we should teach them about African architecture. It should be the main focus, and it should be about how our buildings deals with our surroundings, because most of the times we have European ideas, but that's for European surroundings, not necessarily for in context with ours. So it's really just about relooking at our educational system and really just focusing on our ideas. I think having confidence, actually, you know, having confidence in our ideas and what we produce, and believe that it's better.
Education, as you point out, is very important. Most architects are going to teach and practice what they were taught. So it's a discipline and a profession in architecture that has a strong connection to its tradition, to its lineage. You know, in other words, it reproduces itself, right? And people are going to teach what they were taught. You know, it's going to remain a foundation, even if they try to adapt things and so on. So that's why I asked you, at least some of you must become educators and writers, so that you can start to change that education system. You can bring in new values, different kinds of understanding of how human beings live together, or can live together, or have lived together. You come with different questions, different experiences, different concerns, different interests, right? So don't just be people that look at pictures and try to imitate those pictures. You must ask questions. You must bring yourselves into your spaces, into your universities. And it's difficult to do that, but you have to do it. You have to try. And then hopefully you become educators. And you have something to teach another generation. You know, some of you must become those people. You know, aspire to be those people.
Because he cannot by law live in the cities, huge townships of African workers have grown up on the outskirts of urban centers.
The story of a miracle of modern achievement, a miracle of far-sightedness and wise direction.
Every morning, large numbers of African workers leave the townships to go to their jobs in the cities. Without this pool of cheap labor, the economy of South Africa could not survive.
The illustrious, up-to-date city of Johannesburg. A fabulous tale, a stately monument to one of man's greatest endeavors.
These things echo in apartheid, echo in the townships that were built during apartheid, and the kinds of, you know, houses that were built. You know, the NE, what is it, 51/9. NE means non-European, by the way. And then you have numbers of different versions of that model that was created. You start to see these ideas present in those things, all right? That's what I also try to show you, is that these colonial ideas are circulating. They are present in South Africa, in our architectures, in our landscapes, in our architecture schools. So where I want to end off is to show you those links. This is a book called Ikaya, The Politics of Home. And it's edited by two authors, Clancy and Hickel. Jason Hickel, I think he's South African born or born in Swaziland. He's an anthropologist, and he's got a chapter here, the 5th chapter of this book, Ikaya, and we're going to read a little piece of that chapter, okay? Chapter 5 of the book, in which he calls Engineering the Township Home. Engineering the township home. In other words, how during colonialism and apartheid did architects and planners and the government actually shape the homes that Black urban Africans lived in? How did they shape their houses? How did they shape their townships? How did they shape the way they live in those spaces? All of those things were designed, right? And he goes into some of the deeper conceptual and civilizational stuff, all the stuff we've been speaking about, the modern, the primitive, the civilized, the savage, setting up the world in this way. He goes into how this actually started to shape architecture and shape urban planning. There are many lenses that we can look at those at townships through. But we are pointing out, why are we pointing out the ones that we are pointing out? Because they are so neglected in the way that we're talking about it. You see, we can talk about modernism only in terms of style, or we can talk about modernism in terms of, you know, providing housing. People need housing, there's a housing shortage, people are migrating to the cities. So we look at massive housing on a large scale. How do you provide housing for people? That is another lens that you can look through. We are not talking about those things specifically because there is already so much literature on that. What we are talking about is the things that never get spoken about. We are highlighting the neglected things, right? The things that are fundamental, but that hardly ever get discussed, right? Those are the things we are highlighting, not those other things, because there's enough on that already, okay? So Jason Hickel is writing on how the township, the Black native African township in colonialism and apartheid is being engineered, is being designed, is being imagined, all right? through those lenses and those terms and those frameworks that we were just speaking about. Right? How does it actually shape the spaces that we live in? Okay. It's a long chapter. We're just going to pull out a few pieces of it. So, Jason Hickel writes, the planned township as reluctant colonialism. What does he mean? So he says, in the first half of the 20th century, there's a growth of informal settlements. In other words, Black Africans are moving towards the cities because the world has changed, right? There's mining, there's gold, there's diamonds, the whole landscape has changed. And the urban setting now has opportunities that are not present in the rural countryside. And also because of all kinds of colonial laws and apartheid laws that made things very difficult, you know, like the Land Act. And there are multiple reasons why people are moving to the cities. And informal settlements are now mushrooming, even as they are today, right, around the cities. So he writes here, the growth of informal settlements during the first half of the 20th century caused a great deal of anxiety amongst colonial administrators, right? They were getting a very uncomfortable with if the city is a white city, right? Because that's how it was conceived. Cities are white enclaves. Black Africans belong to the countryside. They are rural people, right? The primitive, the civilized. Right? The idea was that Black Africans are primitive people. They belong in rural environments. Europeans are urban, civilized, sophisticated people. The cities are for them, right? So now you have Black Africans moving to the cities. And this is causing a lot of anxiety. What are these? All of these people are coming here. What are we going to do with them, right? It caused a great deal of anxiety amongst colonial administrators. African slums appeared to Europeans as something of a social evolutionary misfire, right? So these things are all connected. This is part of evolutionary thinking, right? The theories of evolution are not as objective as they present themselves to be. They are immersed in this colonial world. There's a lot of racism in evolutionary thinking because the idea was that the end point of evolution was a white Western European man, a white Western European urban civilized man. And Black Africans and others like them are an earlier, ancient, more animal-like, more savage-like form of man from an earlier time, right? And the civilized man is at the end point of evolution. And these people are rural. They live in uncivilized rural environments. But now look, something is happening here. These Black Africans, which are supposedly primitive, supposedly savages, supposedly belong to the countryside, are now coming to the cities. What is going on here? This is not how evolution works. They should be sticking to the countrysides. What are they doing in the cities, right? So Jason Hickel writes, African slums around the cities appear to Europeans as something of a social evolutionary misfire. Evolution has misfired. These people should be there, but now they're here. What are they doing here? This is not how evolution works. How do we deal with this situation? These are the colonial ideas embedded in these things, hey? Even if they are not spoken about so explicitly, they are there beneath the surface. In South Africa, as across the colonial world, African urbanization, so this is the first half of the 20th century, the early 1900s, African urbanization was viewed as disorderly and dangerous, and as much by colonizers as by the social scientists of the time, right? So Black Africans starting to come to live in the white cities is something that they see as disorderly and dangerous, and they need to manage this. right? We need to manage this danger upon the city now. So Jason Hickel continues. Oh, yeah, and he's got a lot of quotes. So, you know, when you go back into the before democracy in South Africa, and you read newspapers and you read old books, the language is a little jarring for us today, okay? So you just have to take a deep breath and, and just accept that this is how people used to write, okay? So yeah, Jason Hickel is quoting someone from 1944. Carl Polanyi, who's an author writing in 1944, writes, reflecting on his visit to South Africa, he writes about detribalized South Africans, and he writes about them in pathological terms. Pathology meaning there's some serious social, psychological problem afflicting people, right? He says the K word, right, which is normal back then, of South Africa, a noble savage. Again, this word, same words as Corbusier, same ideas as Bannister Fletcher. This person, this being, this creature is a noble savage in South Africa who felt socially secure in his native kraal, but has been transformed into a human variety of half-domesticated animal, dressed in the unrelated, the filthy, the unsightly rags that not the most degenerated white man would wear, a nondescript being without self-respect or standards, veritable human refuse. Right? He's saying half-domesticated animal, right? This savage, this animal that belongs in the countryside has now moved to the city, which is not its natural home. And it's a kind of an abomination. It's a kind of a social evolutionary misfire. What are these creatures doing here, right? They don't belong here. This is what he's saying. It's probably hard for you to hear that, but this is an author writing in 1944, right? These are kind of the ideas, the ways of thinking of the time. So Jason Hickel continues. The very existence. So what are we doing now? We're linking those things we have been speaking about to the actual architecture and planning that was built through the 20th century, through the last years of colonialism and apartheid. Right? We're linking the one thing, the ideas, the cognitive grounds, the concepts, with the spaces and the plans that were produced. We're making that connection now. So Jason Hickel continues, the very existence of urban Black South Africans seems to threaten the basic categories that underpinned both colonialism and social scientific theory between rural, tribal African and urban modern European. Do you understand what he's saying? Right? So in this idea of evolution, which is a very racist idea, it's not an objective idea. You have on the one end what Corbusier called modern times, right? You have the urban, the modern, the European. On the other end, you have the rural, the tribal, the African, the animal, the savage, right? You have these two things. And evolution takes us here to the urban, modern European. But now we have these people that want to be here, that want to be in the city, that want to be urban and modern and live amongst Europeans. This is like a turning the whole world upside down, almost, you know. It threatens, Jason Hickel says, it seems to threaten the very basic categories that underpins colonialism and its ideas, its scientific ideas about society. Do you understand? It's a social evolutionary misfire. It's evolution turned on its head. It's the rural people coming to the urban. It's the tribal people who are coming into the modern space. It's the Africans wanting to be next to the Europeans. What on earth is happening here? We need to manage the situation. Right? This is what Jason Hickel is saying. Precisely the evolutionary schema posited by early social scientists along the trajectory from savagery to civilization. Right? So that's the evolutionary scheme. We have, as human beings, we have moved from savagery to civilization, but now the savages want to be in the city where the civilized people are. What is going on here? That's not how evolution works. This is what they're saying. You can see how deeply problematic these ideas are. You thought science is just science. Science is just objective. Science is just neutral. Well, it isn't, because it has an author. It has people who wrote that, and they wrote it from their perspective and their view of the world. And you see what kind of views are embedded in that kind of science. Okay. Colonial administrators worried that urbanization was producing Africans who were unhinged, right? So they're no longer in this familiar rural environment that they know. They're now in the city. So now all hell is going to break loose. Now they're not going to be able to be managed, to be controlled. Their values are going to fall away that kept them in this particular world. All hell is going to break loose. Chaos is going to break loose. There's going to be disorder and chaos in the city because Africans have now migrated. Okay, so what do we do about this problem? They are no longer bound to their tribal values. Administrators believed that broken families, broken African families, and kinship disorder would inevitably lead to anarchy, immorality, sexual deviance, disease, and their greatest fear of all, violent political agitation. For violence was considered to be a product of spatial and social irrationality, right? They think that all these Africans coming to the city is going to create immorality, chaos, anarchy. It's going to bring disease. There's also going to be a protest against the colonial rule. They worried about all of this. So the state undertook to diffuse this danger, right? So the new black urban Africans must be managed to diffuse the danger that they pose to the colonial city. And how will they do that? By forcibly relocating slum residents into segregated planned townships where they could be civilized for the purposes of control, right? So how are we going to manage them? We are going to build townships for them to live in. And we are going to design those townships in such a way that they are separated from the places that white people live, and they are spaces that will control and manage those black urban Africans and civilize them so that they will become more docile and more manageable and not pose a threat to us. Okay. It was the state's perception of urban Africans as in between, right? In between. They're neither African nor are they modern. They're something that is happening between evolutionary spaces, and they are polluted. It is this idea that they are in between, that they do not belong here, although they are here in the city, but they don't belong here. They are in between, and they are polluted, that propelled this new modernizing project. So Jason Hickel is arguing that he's saying it's the key idea, but it is at least one of the key ideas that is driving the creation of modern townships for black urban Africans, right? He's saying this is one of the key ideas in producing black townships, right? That is all over South Africa today. Every single city has got a segregated black township. Every single city in South Africa, every single town in South Africa. Jason Hickel is trying to trace the historical origins of that. What ideas produced that? Why did the colonial government want to produce townships, segregated townships for black people? Why did it want to do such a thing? Jason Hickel is arguing it is because they were seen as these in-between social evolutionary misfires that brought danger and disease, that they needed to be controlled. They need to be segregated and controlled and managed and kept docile. manageable. This is why those townships were created, Jason Hickel is arguing. Drawing on social scientific theories common at the time, planners believed that planning nuclear families, right? A nuclear family is husband, wife, and kids who live independently in a house. That's like a nuclear family, as opposed to extended families, as opposed to living with your aunties and uncles and grannies and in-laws or whatever other situations you have. They imagine a nuclear families, a little suburban house with a mother and dad and kids in this independent house that is going to manage the Africans and control them and make them docile and manageable. So planners believe that placing people in nuclear families, in detached single-family homes, which now characterizes all the black townships, right? That is what they look like. Detached single-family houses for what must be nuclear families. This model, this kind of home, this kind of township would render Africans safe, docile, productive. Right? It's going to neutralize them. It's going to make them less of a danger to the colonial order and society. The idea, in short, was to domesticate urban Africans. Right? This is the idea. They pose a threat, they pose a danger, and they need to be domesticated. And this is how we will domesticate them. The idea, in short, was to domesticate urban Africans by shaping them in the mold of mid-century European domesticity. Right? How can we make them look like, how can we make an African look like a European? How can we make an African domestic arrangement look like a European one, right? It's to mold them, right? This is why Jason Hickel's title of the article is called Engineering the Township Home. You know, what is it to engineer something? It is to mold something, right? To shape it in the way that you want to shape the thing. So they are seeing black Africans as very problematic because they don't see them as even belonging in a city, but yet they are migrating to the city. So they must be molded in the city. We will mold this African into what it needs to be. We will design its home and the kind of family system it needs to have. We will design its neighborhood. We will design its township and how it moves, how it lives, where it works. We are going to mold this African reality into something that is an echo of what European norms are. And then they will become manageable to us, controllable, domesticated, docile, etc. If you understand what he's saying. Let me just end off with some quotes by the architects and the planners. So you see, you know, we are architects and planners. Let us hear what architects and planners of the time thought, at least some of them, some of the important ones, and then we'll end off. So here's an architect by the name, or an urban planner by the name of P.H. Connell, who writes in 1939. We are dealing with a primitive, there's again Corbusier's words, you see how mainstream these ideas and this terminology was. We are dealing, says Connell in 1939, an urban planner in South Africa, he says, we are dealing with a primitive and backwards people whose mental makeup is relatively easily changed, for better or worse, simply by altering their environment. In other words, says Jason Hickel, in other words, planners believed that civilizing the built environment was the most effective way to civilize its inhabitants, right? So these are primitive people, these are simple people, these are backwards people. They are not suited to the city. We will design environments that will help them to become more urban and more civilized. We will mold them into a particular kind of urban citizen and a particular kind of urban subject. So there's, you know, blocks of flats are produced with nuclear families and that's one way that they think it will happen. Another influential planner, A.J. Cutton, says that townships comprised of freestanding nuclear family houses is the way to go, right? It's not just blocks of flats, but it's a whole township made up of independent nuclear dwellings. That is the way that we are going to manage the situation. And then these townships were arranged around a central point where communal facilities would be located, such as schools, recreational facilities, administrative buildings, right? So all your townships are like this, right? If you've lived in Soweto, in Johannesburg South, or you visited Soweto, it's like this, right? It is a single nuclear family, independent dwellings, generally speaking. And then you have these little centralities where there's a park and a community hall and a church or a school around that center, right? Much of it is like this, right? So this is where it comes from, those ideas. A central point for community facilities, the idea was to facilitate surveillance and control. So it's easy to control those spaces, manage them, surveillance, easy for police to come in, but also to replicate the concentric structure of domestic space in rural areas. Right? So it's also to be like, in the same way as you have the khotla and the kraal and these things in the center of a traditional African settlement, we are mimicking that. Right, so we put these communal facilities in the center, we spread them out into little nuclear families, and we create an environment that is a little bit familiar to them, but that domesticates and manages and controls them, right? Drawing on this romantic conception of a noble savage, right? A noble savage, a savage, an animal, but that it can be civilized, it can be domesticated. It can be managed and molded and controlled, right? It's a savage, but a noble savage, right? These are kind of the ideas, right? So he goes into ideas that underpin these kinds of arrangements, which we've spoken about, ideas that underpin these kinds of houses that were produced, the NE 51/6, NE 51/9, etc. He goes into all of that.
It will be a completely non-racial egalitarian society.
Because the worst of all horrors in the world is to live forever as a slave.
The feeling of cultivating the mind of the European people is more work for the liberals to do there than to come and try to cultivate the mind of the African people.
In a nutshell, we looked at the way the story of modernism is often told, the canonical story, from being positioned in London or the School of Architecture at Wits, and the architects that it produced. And then we shifted perspective to the colonies, right, in Africa or elsewhere, and who we are in that story. Right? And I said, we are not the heroes and heroines of that story when we change our perspective. And then we looked at the kinds of landscapes and architectures that modernism produced in the colonial era and during apartheid. And some of the themes that were embedded, those colonial ideas that were embedded in that, those ideas of evolution, ideas of civilization, ideas of the savage and the primitive and the modern, and all of these supposedly polar opposites, that are all these colonial ideas deeply embedded in the way we made architecture and the way we shaped our cities. So we've inherited all of this stuff. We've inherited it in our cities. We've inherited it in our education systems. And so it's something you need to think about. How do we create different kinds of education? And how do we create different kinds of landscapes that people live in, you know? And how do we live together, you know? We don't want to be segregated and everyone is other to everyone else. Everyone is an enemy to everyone else. We don't want to live like that. How do we create ways in which we can actually live together And how do we create education systems that produce environment, or that will help to facilitate to produce environments like that? Because as South Africans, we doubt to live together. That's our history. We don't know how to do it. Our cities don't. Our cities didn't, our architecture and our planning, and it didn't create that. And now we live in those spaces, and we still don't know how to do it. So this is a huge challenge to you as students of architecture, to think about how we can do that. And very often it is the case, and this will be the very last point I make because we're out of time. Very often it's, within architecture schools, when you do projects, often students want to do sexy projects, If you go to postgrad and you look at the kinds of projects that they do, it's very often it's not designing human settlements or housing, to put it more simplistically. It's not seen as kind of sexy or important, but it is absolutely crucial, It's a critical area. You have to understand how our environments were shaped and how we can think about them differently, how we can shape them differently. And it's a very difficult challenge, but you have to take on that challenge.
Hi.
Hi, Veronica. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for this amazing it was eye-opening, I think, for many of us, including myself as a second year, as it being my second year teaching. And I think on my end, I really enjoyed the portion that you spoke about how the entire cycle of teaching architecture becomes repetitive, in the sense that I inevitably begin to teach what I've learned, and what I've learned is somewhat, to a certain degree, problematic in the longer lineage or longer line or scheme of education as a whole in relation to architecture. And I think for me personally, I started to reevaluate the methods or the nature in which I teach myself. And I think this was quite an insightful conversation and discussion to have. And I just want to thank you for this. I think I, not being the only one that benefited from this discussion and this lecture, it really has placed many of the concepts we've been dealing with in history and theory being very prescribed. It has really placed things into perspective. And we generally encourage the students to formalize their own stance, but they're now formalizing their own stance based on what information. And I think this challenges that information and challenges basically what has been historically given to us as truth. And also challenges us to open up our minds to biases that could be against that very knowledge and truth. So I thank you for that. It was quite informative and hopefully encourages us to think further and to challenge ourselves into breaking into forming our own stances as well.
Okay, thanks, Veronica.
Just thank you, Tariq. Thank you so much. I think you've given a different perspective to the students. We've also covered a lot of modernism, postmodernism, and South African architecture. But what you've brought is definitely different to the classes that we've been giving them, and hopefully this will open up their minds.
Sorry, I just have a simple question, like from the lecture and like from like what I've heard today. It's like really blown my mind, like, and just opened my eyes to so much. So I just have like one question, like, where do we go from here, like in terms of learning more about like regional architecture? Because European architecture is so deep rooted into our society right now. It's so hard to tell the difference. So I just like want to know, is there like some readings and stuff that we could go like read in, like to get more information?
Architecture moves at a snail's pace, unfortunately. So it requires people to be active, you know. You need to be, as I said, you need to be readers, you need to be thinkers, you need to be engaged people. And find a community of like-minded people that you can work with, that you can support each other. And it's going to take a lot of work, eh? You need to bring new kinds of values into architecture, new kinds of knowledge, new kinds of ways of making architecture, not just what buildings look like, you know, that is, or whatever culture you're going to produce is going to produce architecture. So don't be so fixated on what the end product will look like. There will be a product anyway. I think it's almost more important in a way to create a culture that is going to produce a new kind of, well, a different kind of way of doing architecture, you know. That's why I said to you, who are you as a human? Who are you in your family? Who are you in your community? Who are you in your, you know, are you one person when you live in Joburg, and then are you another person when you go back to Limpopo and you go visit your granny and your uncle? And, you know, you mustn't be a schizophrenic human being. Try to bring who you are into the architectural space, and you need to shape it. It needs to incorporate the views and beliefs and values and spirituality and all the things that make you who you are. There is no reason why that needs to be separated from what architecture is, as if architecture is this alien spaceship that lands here and we all have to learn how to live on a spaceship. No, it mustn't be a spaceship. It must be who you are. It must be in sync with who you are and where you are and where we want to be. And that's much easier said than done, but I'm just giving you some impulse to not to feel that you don't belong in this space. In fact, this space needs you. It needs you to become relevant. It needs you to become part of where we are in the world. South African universities, when they were created deliberately to be different to their environment, right? South African universities were created to look like universities in London and Aberdeen and Scotland and Europe. They were designed to look like them. They were designed to reproduce those cultures and the knowledges that were taught there. They were designed to be deliberately different and alien to the African landscape, right? And it's going to take a lot of work, and it's a challenge. It's not easy, it's difficult, but you have to take up that challenge and try to create a different kind of knowledge, different kind of profession, different kind of discipline. And find people to help you to do that.
Okay.
And Tanika says, what changes do you think could be made to how architects are taught? I know that's probably another long conversation, but she's basically asking, how do we break the cycle?
You can read something I wrote. It's a little bit complex, but have a go at it, which is an answer to your question. What things can we change in education? I try to answer that very question. It's an essay I wrote called Epistemic Sites. In other words, where do you intervene in the knowledge system to change things? So I said, you can intervene here and here and here and this place and this place, and this thing will change this and that thing will change that. So I listed a number of sites where you can insert something and it will create a transformative catalytic effect. And I call those things epistemic sites, which is about transforming education. But it's a long answer. I can't give you a full answer at this point. But there are many places, and all of them are difficult. All of them will face challenges.